Hey guys, tonight we drift quietly to the banks of the Nile, where the desert wind moves slowly across golden sand and the river slides through the landscape like a dark ribbon of life. You stand at the edge of an ancient Egyptian village as evening settles in. Mud brick homes glow faintly in the fading light, and somewhere in the distance a temple drum beats with a slow, patient rhythm. The air smells of warm stone, river reeds, and a faint hint of incense drifting from a nearby shrine. But tonight you're not here for the temples or the pyramids. Tonight you're here for the dead. Because in ancient Egypt, death isn't really an ending, it's more like a complicated travel itinerary, one that requires careful packing, detailed preparation, and, as you're about to discover, a truly astonishing amount of linen. You watch as a small funeral procession moves along the dusty path toward the desert. Family members walk slowly behind a wooden stretcher, carrying a wrapped body. The mourners wail in practiced grief, though some also glance around cautiously, making sure the ritual is done properly. In this world, doing death wrong isn't just embarrassing, it could be catastrophic for eternity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, feel free to drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is listening from as we wander through history together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You follow the procession as it leaves the green strip of farmland beside the Nile and moves toward the desert cliffs beyond. This contrast, the fertile river valley against the endless dry desert, is one of the most important facts about ancient Egyptian life. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was the reason civilization existed here at all. Every year the river flooded, spreading rich black soil across the fields. Farmers grew wheat, barley, onions, and flax. Villages thrived along the riverbanks. Life was predictable, rhythmic, dependable, but the desert surrounding that green valley told a very different story. Out there, nothing grew. Out there, bodies didn't rot. And that strange fact would quietly change human history. Historians know that ancient Egyptian civilization began forming around 3100 BCE, when Upper and Lower Egypt were unified under the first pharaoh. From the beginning, Egyptians believed deeply in an afterlife, a continuation of existence that looked surprisingly similar to everyday life, just with fewer taxes and, hopefully, better weather. To them, death was simply a transition. But there was a catch. Your soul, they believed, needed your body. And if your body disappeared, well, things got complicated. You walk beside the funeral procession as they reach the edge of the desert. The mourners pause while priests chant quiet prayers. The wind brushes over the sand, and somewhere above, a hawk circles slowly in the fading light. Egyptians believed the afterlife was a place called the Field of Reeds, a paradise that mirrored the Nile Valley. Crops grew tall, water flowed endlessly, and families lived together again. It sounds peaceful enough. But to get there, your spirit needed something very specific, a preserved physical form. You see, ancient Egyptians believed the human soul wasn't just one thing. It had multiple parts, including the Ka and the Ba. The Ka was a sort of life force, your spiritual double that continued existing after death. The Ba, meanwhile, was often imagined as a bird with a human head that could travel between the world of the living and the dead. It's a little complicated. Imagine your soul being part energy spirit, part magical bird commuter, and part long-term tenant of your own body. If that sounds like a logistical nightmare, congratulations. You're thinking like an ancient Egyptian priest, because if your body decomposed, your Ka might lose its home, and your Ba might not recognize where to return, which meant eternal existence could fall apart rather quickly. So preserving the body became incredibly important. And this is where the desert quietly enters the story. Long before elaborate mummification existed, early Egyptians buried their dead in shallow desert graves. No tombs, no coffins, just simple pits dug into the sand. And something remarkable happened. The hot, dry desert sand naturally dehydrated the bodies. Instead of decaying normally, the corpses dried out, skin tightening, features remaining recognizable. Hair and fingernails sometimes survived for centuries. To early Egyptians, this must have seemed almost miraculous. You bury someone in the sand and years later the body still exists. Not perfectly, of course. Time still leaves its mark. But compared to the messy decay most cultures were used to, the desert performed a kind of accidental preservation. This is one of the earliest confirmed facts about Egyptian burial practices. Natural desert mummification likely inspired the later artificial methods. In other words, the Egyptians didn't invent mummies immediately. Nature showed them the prototype. And the Egyptians, being wonderfully determined people, decided they could probably improve on it. You watch as the funeral procession finishes its rites. The body is carefully lowered into the sand. Family members place pottery jars, small offerings of bread, and a few personal belongings beside the deceased. After all, if you're heading to eternity, it's nice to bring snacks. One mourner places a small carved figurine near the body. These figures, known as shabtis, would later become common burial items, little servant statues meant to work for the dead in the afterlife. Because apparently even paradise still required agricultural labor. Historians still argue whether early Egyptians truly believed these figurines would magically animate, or whether they were symbolic representations of status and comfort. Either way, it's a clever idea. If eternity involves chores, better to outsource them. The grave is slowly covered with sand. The wind smooths the surface until almost nothing remains visible. But beneath the desert, the body begins its strange transformation. Heat dries the flesh. Sand absorbs moisture. Bacteria struggle to survive in the arid environment. Days pass, weeks pass, and the person who once walked along the Nile slowly becomes something new, something preserved, something that looks uncannily like it might wake up again. That eerie possibility lingers in the minds of the living. Because if the desert can preserve a body by accident, what might happen if humans tried to control the process? That quiet question will soon lead Egyptian priests and embalmers down a path of experimentation that lasts thousands of years. A path involving salt, oils, linen, ritual magic. And in one particularly bizarre step you'll see later, a metal hook inserted through the nose. Yes, ancient Egypt gets weird surprisingly fast, but for now you stand beside the silent desert grave while the last light fades over the Nile. The river keeps flowing, the village returns to its nightly routines. And beneath the sand, the earliest chapter of mummification begins without anyone fully realizing the extraordinary tradition it will eventually become. You linger near the edge of the desert, long after the funeral procession disappears back toward the Nile. The sand settles into quiet ripples, and the evening air cools just enough to make the day's heat feel like a distant memory. Somewhere nearby, a night insect starts its slow rhythmic chirping like nature's version of a bedtime metronome. Beneath your feet, the newly buried body lies in the dry earth, already beginning the strange preservation process the desert performs so well. But the ancient Egyptians watching this happen don't think in terms of chemistry or climate. They think in terms of the soul. And in their world, the soul is complicated. If you were hoping for a neat little spirit goes up to heaven explanation, ancient Egypt is about to politely disagree. Their version of the afterlife involves multiple spiritual components, cosmic judges, magical spells, and a journey that feels suspiciously like passing through airport security, except the consequences are a bit more permanent. One of the most important elements of the Egyptian soul is something called the ka. Think of the ka as your life force, the invisible energy that animates you while you're alive. Egyptians believed every person was born with a ka, and when you died, the ka continued to exist. But there was a small logistical issue. The ka needed somewhere to live. Specifically, it needed your body. If the body vanished, the ka might wander without purpose, which was not ideal if you were aiming for a peaceful eternity in the field of reeds. Ancient Egyptians took this extremely seriously. Preserving the body wasn't just tradition, it was spiritual housing policy. Then there was the ba. The ba is one of the more visually interesting ideas in Egyptian religion. It was often depicted as a bird with a human head flying freely between the worlds of the living and the dead. During the day, the ba could leave the tomb and travel about. At night, it returned to the body, which meant the body had to remain recognizable. Imagine leaving home every morning and hoping your house is still standing when you get back. That's basically the situation the ba was dealing with. Historians widely agree that these beliefs are central to why Egyptians became so obsessed with preserving the dead. The body wasn't just remains, it was a kind of spiritual anchor. Lose the anchor, and eternity might drift off course. You wander back toward the village as lanterns begin to flicker along the streets. The Nile glimmers under the rising moon, and fishermen quietly pull in their nets. Life continues as it always does here, slow, steady, and tied to the river's rhythm. Yet death is never far from the minds of the people living here. The Egyptians believed the afterlife involved a journey through a supernatural realm called the Duat. To get there, the soul had to pass through dangerous regions, guarded gates, and strange divine beings. Along the way, spells and prayers could help guide the traveller safely. Think of it as an ancient travel guidebook, but written in hieroglyphs and possibly supervised by a jackal-headed god. That god would be Anubis, one of the most recognizable figures in Egyptian mythology. Anubis was the protector of the dead and the patron deity of embalmers. With the head of a jackal and the body of a man, he watched over burial rituals and guided souls toward judgment. The jackal imagery wasn't random. Jackals often prowled desert cemeteries, digging into shallow graves. By turning the animal into a guardian god, Egyptians symbolically transformed a grave robber into a protector. It's a clever bit of religious rebranding. You walk past a small shrine where a carved figure of Anubis stands watch, black stone gleaming faintly in the lantern light. A priest places fresh incense before the statue, murmuring a quiet prayer. Death here is treated with a kind of careful respect, almost like dealing with a powerful but slightly unpredictable neighbor. But preserving the body wasn't the only requirement for eternal life. There was also the matter of judgment. According to Egyptian belief, when you died, your heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess representing truth and cosmic balance. Ma'at, if your heart was light, you passed into the afterlife. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, things got awkward. Because waiting nearby was a creature with one of the strangest job descriptions in mythology. Meet Amit. Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, Amit existed for one reason: to eat the hearts of the unworthy. If she devoured your heart, your soul ceased to exist entirely. No afterlife, no field of reeds, just cosmic deletion. Historians still argue whether ordinary Egyptians truly feared this judgment as much as religious texts suggest, or whether the idea mainly reinforced moral behavior in society. Either way, it certainly added a bit of pressure to the afterlife application process. you pass a group of villagers sitting outside a home, sharing bread and quiet conversation under the stars. Their laughter rises briefly into the warm night air. It's strange to think that while daily life here looks simple, farming, fishing, family dinners, nearly everyone carries this elaborate vision of the afterlife in the back of their mind, because eternity, for the Egyptians, wasn't abstract. It was planned, prepared, engineered, and preserving the body became the foundation of that entire system. Over time, Egyptians realized something unsettling. The natural desert burials that preserved bodies worked well, but only under certain conditions. If graves were deeper, if moisture entered the soil, or if bodies were placed in coffins, the preservation stopped working. The body would decay normally, which meant the car might lose its home. You can almost imagine the ancient priests scratching their heads over this problem. The desert had shown them preservation was possible. Now they just had to figure out how to reproduce it deliberately. And that curiosity, the desire to control what nature had started, will slowly lead Egyptian society toward one of the most elaborate funerary traditions in human history. Over centuries, experimentation begins. Embalmers test oils. They try drying techniques. They wrap bodies in linen. Sometimes the results work beautifully. Other times, let's just say the early prototypes, were less than perfect. There's even a quirky historical detail archaeologists occasionally mention. Some early attempts at artificial preservation accidentally caused bodies to darken dramatically, making the skin look almost blackened. This may have influenced the association between the color black and rebirth in Egyptian symbolism. Historians still argue whether that connection was intentional or simply a coincidence noticed after the fact. Either way, the Egyptians were clearly paying attention, because once they understood that preserving the body could protect the soul, they committed to perfecting the process. And in the centuries ahead, along the banks of the Nile, specialized workshops will emerge, priests, chemists, artisans, all dedicated to a single goal, turning the dead into something that could last forever. The wind drifts gently through the palm trees beside the river as the village settles into sleep. And somewhere out in the desert, beneath quiet layers of sand, the earliest preserved bodies lie waiting, silent teachers that will inspire one of the strangest, most meticulous practices the ancient world ever created. Soon, humans will take over the work the desert once did alone, and that's when mummification truly begins. The sun rises slowly over the Nile, turning the river into a sheet of molten gold. You wake to the sounds of village life beginning again, goats bleating somewhere in the distance, the creak of wooden boats being pushed into the water, and the low murmur of farmers already discussing the day's work. Life in ancient Egypt moves with comforting regularity. The Nile floods, crops grow, children are born, and eventually everyone ends up back in the desert. You walk beyond the fields again toward the same stretch of sandy burial ground you visited last night. The desert air is already warming, though the morning breeze still carries a faint coolness. Here and there, small mounds mark older graves, some barely visible after years of shifting sand. If you were to dig one up, and please try not to, the locals would definitely object. You might discover something surprising. Many of the earliest bodies buried here look remarkably intact. Skin dried tight against bone, hair still clinging to the scalp. Sometimes even facial features preserved enough to recognize the person. This is one of the most widely accepted facts among archaeologists studying early Egyptian burials. Before formal mummification existed, the desert itself naturally preserved bodies through dehydration. The dry sand pulled moisture from the corpse so quickly that bacteria, the usual culprits of decay, could barely get started. Nature had accidentally invented mummification. and ancient Egyptians were observant enough to notice. You imagine a family returning to a burial site years later, perhaps reopening a grave to bury another relative nearby. When the sand shifts aside, they see the body of their ancestor still there, still recognizable, not gone, not dissolved into the earth, just waiting. It must have been eerie, a little comforting, and definitely inspiring. Because if preserving the body allowed the soul to return home, remember that wandering bar from last night, then the desert had just provided proof that it could work. The body stayed, the soul had a place. Eternity suddenly looked much more achievable. You crouch beside one of the older grave markers. Unlike the monumental tombs Egypt will later become famous for, these early burials are humble. Most consist of a shallow pit, a simple mat, and a few pottery vessels containing food or drink. Some graves include beads or small tools, others include nothing at all, but almost all of them share one detail. The body is positioned carefully, usually curled slightly on its side, facing west. West mattered. The sun set in the west each evening, disappearing into the land of the dead. Egyptians believed the afterlife existed somewhere beyond that glowing horizon. So naturally, that's the direction you wanted to be facing. Think of it as setting your GPS toward eternity. You brush some sand away from the ground and imagine what the earliest Egyptians must have thought as they began experimenting with burial practices. At first, the desert worked perfectly, but then things started changing. As Egyptian society grew more complex, especially after the unification of the kingdom around 3100 BCE, people began building more elaborate graves. Instead of shallow pits in open sand, bodies were placed in wooden coffins or stone-lined tombs. It sounded like an upgrade. More protection, more dignity, less chance of wandering jackals ruining the ceremony. There was just one problem. The preservation stopped working. Without direct contact with the dry sand, the bodies began decomposing normally, which was a serious issue if you believed the soul depended on that body remaining intact. You can almost picture the priests and mourners discovering this unfortunate side effect. They open a tomb years later, and instead of a preserved ancestor, they find decay. For a culture deeply invested in the afterlife, this wasn't just disappointing, it was a theological crisis. Historians still argue whether the shift from natural desert burial to artificial mummification happened quickly or evolved gradually over centuries. Most evidence suggests it was a slow process of trial and error, and, frankly, a fair amount of guesswork. Early attempts at preserving bodies involved wrapping them in linen or covering them with plant oils and resins. Some embalmers experimented with heating or drying techniques. Results varied. Sometimes the body preserved fairly well. Other times, well, let's just say early embalmers probably learned a lot from their mistakes. One quirky detail archaeologists have found in some early burials is the presence of excessive linen padding. It seems embalmers occasionally tried to maintain the body's shape by stuffing linen into areas where decay had already begun. Imagine trying to keep a pillow fluffy for eternity. It's oddly practical, but also slightly unsettling. You wander deeper into the burial grounds, where a few larger graves stand out from the rest. These belong to wealthier members of the community, local officials, priests, or successful landowners. Even in death, social status mattered. Richer Egyptians could afford better burial materials, more elaborate coffins, and more careful preservation attempts. Poorer individuals often relied entirely on the desert's natural mummification process. Ironically, that sometimes worked better. Nature, it turns out, was still the most reliable embalmer around. But Egyptian curiosity kept pushing things forward. Priests began studying the bodies that preserved well in the desert and comparing them to those that decayed inside tombs. They realized moisture was the enemy. If the body could be completely dried, it might survive for centuries. That realization was a turning point, because Egypt just happened to have a substance perfectly suited for the job. Natron. Natron was a naturally occurring salt mixture found in dry lake beds throughout Egypt. It absorbed moisture extremely well, so well in fact, that Egyptians already used it for cleaning, preserving food, and even making certain types of soap. Soon, embalmers began experimenting with it on the dead. They packed bodies in natron, covered them with it, sometimes even filled body cavities with it. And slowly, gradually, something remarkable happened. Artificial mummification started working, not perfectly yet, but well enough to inspire confidence. The Egyptians had discovered a way to replicate what the desert once did by accident. They could dry a body intentionally, preserve it deliberately, engineer eternity. As the morning sun climbs higher, you notice a pair of priests walking across the burial ground carrying baskets of linen cloth. Their robes flutter softly in the breeze, and they speak quietly to each other about preparations for another burial. Already, specialized knowledge is forming. Already, certain individuals are becoming experts in the care of the dead. Soon, entire workshops will exist for this purpose, places where trained embalmers transform human bodies into carefully prepared mummies. And when that happens, mummification will evolve from a clever imitation of nature into a full-fledged industry. Complete with tools, procedures, and as you'll soon discover, a rather alarming metal hook. But for now, the desert still whispers the original secret. Dry the body, preserve the form, and perhaps, just perhaps, the soul will find its way home again. The sun climbs higher over the Nile Valley, warming the mud brick walls of the village until they glow a dusty gold. Farmers head toward their fields with wooden hoes slung over their shoulders. Fishermen push reed boats into the river, and somewhere a baker opens a clay oven, releasing the smell of fresh bread into the morning air. Life goes on, as it always does. But just beyond the bustle of the village, tucked near the edge of the desert cliffs, another kind of work is quietly taking place. Work for the dead. You follow a narrow path toward a low building made of limestone blocks. At first glance, it doesn't look particularly impressive. No towering columns, no massive statues guarding the entrance, but the faint scent drifting from inside, resin, oils, and something sharp like salt, tells you you've arrived somewhere unusual. This is an embalming workshop. Here, the ancient Egyptians are beginning to turn death into a specialized craft. By around the time of the Old Kingdom, roughly 2600 BCE, mummification had evolved beyond simple desert burials. As tombs grew more elaborate and coffins separated bodies from the preserving sand, embalmers developed increasingly deliberate methods for preserving the dead. And, like most complicated tasks in human history, it eventually required professionals. You step inside the workshop. The room is cool and dim compared to the bright desert outside. Clay jars line the walls. Rolls of linen sit stacked neatly on wooden tables. Small bowls of oils, resins, and powders rest beside simple bronze tools. In the center of the room lies a long stone table slightly tilted so liquids can drain away. Let's just say this isn't a place where you schedule spa appointments. Several men in simple linen robes move carefully around the room. Their expressions are calm, almost routine. To them this is skilled work, something learned through practice and passed down through generations. These are embalmers. And in ancient Egyptian society they occupy a strange middle ground. Their work is sacred, tied closely to religion and the afterlife. But it also involves handling dead bodies all day, which means most ordinary Egyptians probably kept a respectful distance, kind of like how people today admire surgeons. but don't necessarily want to watch them work. At the head of the room stands a priest wearing a distinctive jackal mask. He represents the god you met earlier, Anubis. During certain rituals, priests would wear masks of Anubis while performing embalming ceremonies, symbolically allowing the god himself to guide the process. It's a powerful image, a human body preparing another human body for eternity, while pretending, at least a little, that a jackal-headed deity is supervising the whole operation. Historians agree that religion and practicality blended tightly in Egyptian mummification. The procedures weren't just technical, they were deeply symbolic acts meant to ensure the deceased's safe journey into the afterlife. You watch as the embalmers begin preparing a body brought from the village earlier that morning. The relatives have already said their goodbyes. Now the professionals take over. First, the body is washed. Water from the Nile is poured gently over the skin while priests recite quiet prayers. Cleaning the body served both hygienic and ritual purposes. Egyptians believed purity was essential when dealing with sacred transformations. It's also a sensible step if your job involves preserving someone for the next 3,000 years. After washing, the embalmers inspect the body carefully. They check the limbs, examine the abdomen, plan the next steps, because preserving a human body is more complicated than simply drying it in the sun. Internal organs decay quickly, and if left inside, they can ruin the entire process. This realization took Egyptians centuries to fully understand. Early experiments with mummification sometimes failed because internal tissues broke down before the drying process finished. Eventually, embalmers concluded that certain organs had to be removed entirely, which leads to one of the more surprising facts about Egyptian anatomy knowledge. Despite having no modern medical science, embalmers became extremely familiar with the human body through their work. Over generations, they learned where organs were located, how to remove them, and how different treatments affected preservation. It was a strange kind of hands-on biology class, one that probably didn't come with a syllabus. But before we get to the organ removal, don't worry, we'll keep things PG-13, the embalmers begin another crucial step, preparing the body with oils and resins. They rub aromatic substances into the skin. Some oils come from local plants. Others are imported from distant regions of the ancient world, places like Punt, a mysterious trading partner whose exact location historians still debate today. Some scholars believe Punt was somewhere near modern Eritrea or Somalia. Historians still argue whether certain embalming resins were used primarily for preservation or for religious symbolism. Either way, they had a pleasant side effect. They masked unpleasant smells, which, if you're spending weeks working with the dead, is probably appreciated. One young apprentice carefully unwraps a bundle of linen strips, placing them neatly beside the table. Linen came from flax plants grown along the Nile, and Egyptians were masters at weaving it into strong, durable cloth. Later, hundreds of these strips will be used to wrap the body layer by layer. Yes, hundreds. Mummification was not a quick job. In fact, the entire process could take around 70 days, a detail recorded by ancient Greek historian Herodotus when he visited Egypt centuries later. Herodotus described different levels of mummification depending on what a family could afford. Wealthy individuals received the most elaborate treatment, while poorer Egyptians sometimes received simplified versions. Historians still argue whether Herodotus's descriptions were completely accurate or slightly exaggerated. After all, he was known for telling colourful stories. But archaeological evidence suggests he wasn't far off. Mummification really was a long, meticulous process. As the embalmers continue preparing the body, you notice something curious hanging from a small wooden rack nearby. A thin metal tool, long, curved slightly at the end. It looks suspiciously like a hook. You'll soon learn why that hook exists, and once you do, you may never think about ancient Egyptian nose anatomy the same way again. But for now, the workshop hums quietly with careful activity. Linen rustles softly, clay jars clink against stone tables, priests murmur prayers that echo gently against the walls. Outside, life along the Nile carries on as usual, children playing near the riverbank, farmers tending fields, merchants trading goods beneath palm trees. Inside this workshop, however, time moves differently, because here the Egyptians are attempting something extraordinary. They are trying to defeat decay, to outsmart nature, to build bodies capable of surviving not just years, but thousands of them. And step by careful step, experiment by experiment, they're getting closer to perfecting the art of turning the dead into mummies. The embalming workshop is quiet except for the soft rustle of linen and the occasional clink of clay jars being moved across the stone floor. Outside, the Nile Valley hums with life, but inside this room time seems to slow down. The embalmers move carefully, almost ceremonially, as if every motion matters. And in a way it does, because preserving the body correctly could mean the difference between eternal peace and spiritual confusion for the deceased. You stand near the long stone embalming table as the priests prepare for the next step. The body has already been washed with Nile water and anointed with fragrant oils. Now the embalmers gather their tools. Among them is that thin, curved instrument you noticed earlier, a metal hook. It's small, delicate, and surprisingly simple for a tool involved in one of the strangest medical procedures of the ancient world. Because the next task involves removing the brain. Now, if you're wondering why Egyptians would remove the brain before mummification, the answer is surprisingly straightforward. It decays quickly and doesn't preserve well. Over time, embalmers realized that leaving it inside the skull could cause problems during the drying process. So they developed a rather creative solution. Instead of opening the skull, which would damage the face, they went in through the nose. Yes, through the nose. You watch as one of the embalmers gently tilts their head back. With careful precision, he inserts the hooked tool into the nostril and begins working it upward through the nasal passage toward the skull cavity. It sounds alarming, but the embalmers are surprisingly skilled at this. The thin bone separating the nasal cavity from the brain chamber could be pierced with the tool, allowing access to the soft brain tissue inside. From there, the embalmers would break up the brain matter and gradually remove it in pieces. Historians widely agree that this technique became standard during the height of Egyptian mummification practices. It allowed the skull to remain mostly intact while eliminating one of the fastest decaying organs. There's even evidence that sometimes the brain was liquefied and allowed to drain out naturally, which, if you're imagining it happening right now, might make you appreciate modern medical gloves just a little more. Interestingly, the brain wasn't considered particularly important by the ancient Egyptians. They believed the heart was the true center of intelligence, emotion, and personality. So while the brain was removed and discarded, the heart was usually left inside the body. This belief ties directly to the afterlife judgment you heard about earlier, the weighing of the heart against the feather of Mahat. Mahat, without your heart, you couldn't participate in that judgment, and without passing that test, well, remember the unfortunate fate involving Amit. Amit, so the heart stayed. The brain, meanwhile, didn't get the same respect. Historians still argue whether Egyptians truly believed the brain had no purpose, or whether they simply didn't recognize its role in thinking. Either way, ancient embalmers treated it more like disposable packing material than the control center we now know it to be. You watch as the embalmers finish their delicate work with the hook. Once the skull cavity is cleared, They rinse it with palm wine and aromatic oils to help prevent decay and eliminate odors. Palm wine wasn't just for relaxing evenings along the Nile, it also worked surprisingly well as an early disinfectant. Another small example of Egyptians combining practicality with ritual. Nearby, an apprentice carefully cleans the metal hook before placing it back on the wooden rack. Tools like this were used repeatedly, though they were likely cleaned with oils or alcohol between procedures. Not quite modern sanitation standards, but better than nothing. As the brain removal concludes, the embalmers move to the next major challenge, the internal organs. Unlike the brain, many of these organs were considered spiritually important. The liver, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, each played a role not just in the body but in the soul's continued existence. But they couldn't remain inside the body during the drying process. Left alone, they would decompose far too quickly. So they had to be removed carefully and preserved separately. You notice one of the embalmers reach for a small blade made of obsidian, a type of volcanic glass, sharper than many modern surgical instruments. With a precise motion, he makes a small incision along the left side of the abdomen. It's a single, clean cut, just large enough to access the internal organs. Ancient Egyptian texts describe this part of the process with an odd mixture of practicality and ritual drama. In some traditions, the person making the incision would symbolically flee the room afterward, while others pretended to chase them away, shouting insults. Historians still debate whether this ritual was meant to express disgust at damaging the body or simply served as theatrical tradition during the embalming ceremony. Either way, it adds a slightly comedic moment to an otherwise serious procedure. Imagine performing delicate preservation surgery while your co-workers dramatically chase someone around the room. Ancient workplaces were apparently just as quirky as modern ones. The removed organs are then placed carefully into bowls where they will soon undergo their own preservation process. Soon, they'll be stored in special containers you'll see in the next stage of mummification. Containers that are some of the most recognizable objects in Egyptian burial practices. But for now, the embalmers focus on completing the preparation of the body. The skull has been emptied, the internal organs are removed, the body cavity will soon be cleaned, packed with drying substances and sealed. Step by step, the Egyptians are dismantling the parts of the body most vulnerable to decay, not out of disrespect, but out of a very determined belief that the person lying here deserves to exist forever. Outside, the afternoon sun burns bright over the desert sands. Inside the workshop, the embalmers continue their careful work. And with every strange, precise step, the ancient Egyptians move closer to mastering one of history's most remarkable arts, turning fragile human bodies into something that can survive the centuries. The embalming workshop grows warmer as the afternoon sun presses down on the limestone walls. Outside, the desert air shimmers in waves of heat, but inside the room the embalmers continue their work with quiet focus. The body lies still on the slanted stone table, already transformed by the careful steps you've watched so far. The brain has been removed through the nose, the abdomen has been opened, and now the internal organs rest nearby in small bowls, waiting for their own strange journey toward preservation. You lean closer, noticing that each organ is treated with surprising care. The embalmers rinse them gently with palm wine and fragrant oils, removing fluids and impurities before beginning the drying process. This step is crucial. Organs decay quickly, far faster than muscle or skin. If they were simply placed back into the body, the entire preservation effort could fail. Ancient embalmers understood this through centuries of observation and experimentation. So they developed a solution that would become one of the most recognizable features of Egyptian burial practices: canopic jars. A young apprentice carries over 4 beautifully carved containers made of alabaster. Each jar has a lid shaped like a different head, and each head represents one of the protective spirits responsible for guarding the organs. These guardians are known as the four sons of Horus. Horus. Though the jars are named after Horus, the famous falcon-headed sky god, the four figures themselves each have their own distinct identity and purpose. The first jar bears the head of a human. Inside it will go the liver. This jar belongs to Imseti, who protects that organ and is watched over by the goddess Isis. The second jar has the head of a baboon. This one holds the lungs and belongs to Hapi, guarded by the goddess Nephthys. The third jar displays the head of a jackal. Inside go the stomach and the protection of Duamutef, watched by the goddess Neith. The final jar has the head of a falcon. It holds the intestines and belongs to Kebesenuef, protected by the goddess Selket. Each jar forms part of a spiritual security system designed to keep the organs safe in the afterlife. Ancient Egyptians believed these protective deities would guard the organs from harm and ensure they remained connected to the deceased person's soul. It's almost like setting up 4 supernatural storage lockers for eternity. You watch as the embalmers carefully prepare each organ. They coat them in oils and wrap them with small strips of linen before placing them gently into their respective jars. Historians widely agree that canopic jars became common during Egypt's Middle Kingdom, though earlier versions of organ storage existed before the system was fully standardized. But here's an interesting twist. In later periods of Egyptian history, embalmers sometimes stopped placing organs in jars altogether. Instead, they treated the organs with natron and returned them to the body cavity after preservation. The canopic jars still appeared in the tomb, but they were sometimes empty. Historians still argue whether this change was purely symbolic or if it reflected evolving religious ideas about bodily completeness in the afterlife. Either way, the jars remained a powerful ritual object, and they looked impressive, sitting beside a mummy's coffin. One of the embalmers now turns his attention back to the body itself. With the organs removed, the body cavity is rinsed thoroughly using palm wine and crushed herbs. The mixture helps cleanse the interior and reduce bacteria that could cause decay. Then something unexpected happens. The embalmers begin filling the body with packing material, small bundles of linen, powdered natron, occasionally sawdust or resin. All of it placed carefully inside the cavity to absorb moisture and maintain the body's shape during the drying process. Without this internal support, the body might collapse inward as it dehydrates. The goal isn't just preservation, it's preservation that still looks human. Because remember, the BA spirit needs to recognize its body when it returns. Imagine coming home from a long day of flying around the spirit world only to find your body looking like a deflated wineskin. Not ideal. So you notice the priests quietly chanting as the work continues. Their voices rise and fall in a steady rhythm, blending prayer with procedure. Religion and science, at least the ancient Egyptian version of science, are completely intertwined here. Historians still debate how much of the embalming process was driven by religious tradition versus practical experimentation. Some scholars believe embalmers learned preservation techniques through trial and error over centuries, while others argue that many procedures were guided primarily by spiritual beliefs. In reality, it was probably a mixture of both. Humans tend to mix faith and practicality whenever they're trying to solve big problems, and preserving a human body for eternity definitely qualifies as a big problem. As the embalmers finish preparing the organs and sealing the body cavity, they step back briefly to inspect their work. The body now lies ready for the most important stage of the entire process, drying. Because everything you've seen so far, the organ removal, the washing, the oils, has simply been preparation. The real transformation happens next. Soon, the body will be completely covered in a powerful natural salt that will slowly draw every drop of moisture from the flesh. It will take weeks. 40 days, according to many historical accounts. During that time, the body will shrink, tighten, and gradually become something new, something no longer subject to ordinary decay. Outside, the desert wind begins to rise again, sweeping sand across the burial grounds nearby. Inside the workshop, the embalmers gather the next set of tools and materials, and at the center of it all waits the most important ingredient in the entire ancient Egyptian recipe for immortality: natron. Taitita. The afternoon light fades slowly outside the embalming workshop, but inside the work continues with patient determination. The body on the stone table has now been carefully prepared, organs removed, cavities cleaned, linen packing inserted, and the incision sealed. Everything so far has been preparation. The real transformation is about to begin. One of the embalmers opens a large clay container sitting against the wall. Inside is a coarse white substance that looks a little like rough sea salt. When he scoops it into a shallow wooden tray, it crunches softly, grains shifting against one another like dry sand. This is natron. Natron is one of the most important ingredients in the entire process of mummification. It's a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, salt, and sodium sulfate, though of course the ancient Egyptians didn't know the chemical formulas. Ancient workers collected the mineral there and transported it along the river for various uses, and embalming workshops used a lot of it. You watch as the embalmers begin carefully covering the body with thick layers of natron. They pour it over the torso, the limbs, the face, until the figure on the table looks almost buried beneath a white crust. Some of the natron is packed inside the body cavity as well, where it will continue absorbing moisture from within. The goal is simple but incredibly effective. Remove all water from the body. Without water, bacteria cannot survive long enough to cause decay. This principle, dehydration as preservation, is the same one the desert sand performed naturally in those early burials you saw before. Now the Egyptians are simply recreating the desert in a controlled way. Historians widely agree that this stage of the process lasted about 40 days, though the entire mummification ritual could take around 70 days from start to finish. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus famously recorded that 70-day timeline during his visit to Egypt in the 5th century BCE. Some scholars still debate whether every embalming actually lasted that long, or if the number carried symbolic religious meaning. 70 was considered a sacred number in some ancient traditions. Either way, the drying period was lengthy. For the next several weeks, the body will remain buried in natron. Slowly, quietly, moisture will leave the skin and muscles, the tissues will shrink, the body will become lighter and firmer. In a strange way, it's like turning a fresh grape into a raisin, except the Egyptians are doing it intentionally with a human body, which is a sentence that probably sounded less weird to them than it does to us. You notice the embalmers smoothing the salt around the arms and legs to ensure even coverage. They work methodically, making sure no part of the body is left exposed. A poorly dried area could cause the entire process to fail. And after weeks of preparation, nobody wants that. One apprentice checks a row of bodies already undergoing the drying stage along the far wall of the workshop. Each lies in its own shallow trough filled with natron, quietly transforming day by day. It's oddly peaceful. There's no rushing here, just time doing its work. One quirky detail archaeologists have discovered is that embalmers sometimes reuse natron after a drying cycle, especially for lower-cost burials. The salt would still absorb moisture, though perhaps not as efficiently. Think of it as the ancient Egyptian version of recycling. Historians still argue whether this practice affected the quality of preservation in cheaper mummifications. Some mummies show signs of less thorough dehydration, which may reflect the difference between premium embalming services and budget-friendly packages. Yes, even in ancient Egypt, the afterlife had pricing tiers. Herodotus actually described 3 different levels of mummification offered to families. The most expensive involved full organ removal and careful drying. A middle-tier option used chemical injections to dissolve internal tissues. The cheapest method involved minimal treatment before burial, so if you were wealthy, your mummy might end up looking remarkably well preserved. If you were poor, well, eternity might come with fewer luxury features. You wander to the doorway of the workshop, watching the Nile as the sun begins to set. The river reflects the deep orange sky, while birds glide low over the water. Life outside moves quickly, but inside the slow work of preserving the dead continues day after day. You imagine what happens during those 40 days of drying. The embalmers check the bodies periodically, adjust the natron, ensure everything remains properly covered, and gradually the transformation becomes visible. Skin tightens around bone, fingers shrink slightly, the entire body grows lighter, as though the weight of life itself is being gently removed. Yet the shape remains, the face is still recognizable. This was the true genius of Egyptian mummification. They didn't just want bones. They wanted the person to remain identifiable, because the BA spirit you learned about earlier still needs to find its way back. Imagine returning from a long spiritual journey only to discover your body has completely disappeared. That would make eternity rather inconvenient. So the embalmers keep working patiently, trusting the natron to perform its quiet magic. 40 days pass. Then finally the drying stage ends. The body is lifted from the salt. And what remains is something remarkable. The skin is darkened and leathery. The muscles have tightened. The body has lost most of its moisture, becoming incredibly resistant to decay. It is no longer simply a corpse. It is the beginning of a mummy. But the transformation isn't finished yet, not even close, because the next stage will involve perfumes, resins, and enough linen bandages to wrap a small sailing boat. Layer by layer, the Egyptians will now rebuild the body they have dried, carefully restoring its shape and preparing it for the long sleep of eternity. And as strange as the process has been so far, the wrapping ritual that comes next might be the most meticulous part of all. The 40 days pass quietly in the embalming workshop. Outside, the Nile continues its patient rhythm, boats gliding across the water, farmers tending their crops, children splashing along the muddy banks. Seasons turn slowly in ancient Egypt, guided by the river's dependable flooding cycle. Inside the workshop, however, the embalmers measure time differently. They measure it in dryness. You return to the room on the day the natron is finally removed. The white salt that once buried the body now lies piled in shallow trays nearby, its work complete. The embalmers brush away the remaining grains with soft cloths, revealing the transformed figure beneath. The change is remarkable. The skin has darkened to a leathery brown tone, drawn tight over the bones. The body looks thinner, almost delicate, but it remains fully recognizable as the person who once lived along the Nile. This step, the drying stage, is widely considered the most important part of mummification. Without it, no amount of linen or ritual could stop decay. But now that the body is dry, the embalmers move on to something almost artistic. Reconstruction. You watch as one of the priests lifts a small jar and pours a thick amber liquid into a bowl. The smell spreads instantly through the room, warm, sweet, and slightly smoky. Resin. Tree resins were widely used in Egyptian embalming. Some came from local plants, while others were imported through long-distance trade routes from the eastern Mediterranean or even farther away. Historians have identified substances like pine resin, myrrh, and frankincense in many ancient mummies. These materials not only helped preserve the body, but also filled the wrappings with pleasant aromas, which is helpful when your long-term plan involves sharing a tomb chamber with someone for eternity. The embalmers begin rubbing oils and resins gently into the dried skin. This step restores some flexibility to the tissues, preventing the body from becoming too brittle. It also adds another protective barrier against moisture and insects. And, let's be honest, it probably makes the mummy smell significantly better. A young apprentice carefully brings over bundles of linen cloth. The strips are long and narrow, woven from flax plants grown along the Nile Valley. Linen was one of Egypt's most valuable textiles. The finest versions were incredibly smooth and almost translucent, while cheaper varieties were thicker and rougher. For mummification, huge quantities were required, hundreds of meters in some cases, sometimes even more. Archaeologists studying royal mummies have found layers upon layers of linen wrapping, so many that unwrapping them can take hours. You watch as the embalmers begin with the fingers and toes. Thin strips of linen are wrapped carefully around each digit, forming neat white coverings. It's surprisingly meticulous work. Every finger, every toe, wrapped individually. Once the smaller parts are finished, the embalmers move to the hands and feet, binding them in slightly thicker layers of cloth. As they work, they brush resin between some of the layers, helping the linen stick together like a natural glue. This combination of resin and linen eventually hardens into a protective shell around the body. Think of it as the ancient Egyptian version of shrink wrapping, just with a lot more ceremony involved. Historians widely agree that wrapping was both practical and symbolic. Practically, the linen protected the dried body from damage. Symbolically, it recreated the mythological story of the god Osiris. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris, the god of the afterlife, was murdered and dismembered by his brother Seth. His wife Isis gathered the pieces of his body and wrapped them in linen, restoring him to life as the ruler of the underworld. Because of this story, every mummy became a symbolic version of Osiris, wrapped, restored, prepared for rebirth in the afterlife. It's a powerful connection between myth and ritual. You notice the embalmers chanting quietly again as they work, their voices rising and falling in rhythmic prayers. Each layer of linen is applied with deliberate care, accompanied by words meant to protect the deceased on their journey. Some spells come from ancient funerary texts that will eventually be known as the Book of the Dead. Book of the Dead. These texts contained magical formulas intended to guide the soul through the dangers of the afterlife. Not every mummy had a full copy of the text, but many burials included fragments of these spells written on papyrus. Historians still debate how widely ordinary Egyptians understood these writings. Some scholars believe priests performed the rituals, while most families simply trusted the experts to handle the spiritual details. Kind of like hiring a lawyer for paperwork you'd rather not read yourself. The wrapping continues for hours. Arms are bound gently along the body. The torso receives thick layers of linen. Finally, the head is wrapped, leaving the recognizable shape of the face beneath the cloth. One quirky detail archaeologists have noticed is that some embalmers occasionally used old household linen for wrapping. Pieces of clothing, sheets, and other textiles might be cut into strips and reused, which means some mummies are technically wrapped in recycled laundry. Historians still argue whether this practice was purely economical or whether families deliberately used personal garments to keep a connection with the deceased. Either explanation makes a certain amount of sense. As the final layers of linen are secured, the body now looks completely transformed. The human form is still visible beneath the wrappings, but the individual details are hidden beneath a pale cocoon of cloth. the mummy is nearly complete. But before the wrapping is finished entirely, the embalmers will add something special between the layers: small objects, hidden charms, magical protections meant to guard the body and soul during the long journey ahead. Because in ancient Egypt, preparing someone for eternity wasn't just about preservation, it was about protection. And the next step involves filling those linen layers with a collection of mysterious objects designed to keep the dead safe forever. The embalming room is quieter now, the long hours of wrapping having settled into a calm, deliberate rhythm. The body on the table is already transformed, limbs bound neatly in linen, torso layered in pale cloth, the shape of the face faintly visible beneath carefully placed wrappings. Yet the embalmers are not finished, not even close. Because hidden within those layers of linen will be a collection of objects that look small, almost decorative, but carry enormous spiritual importance. Amulets. You watch as a priest opens a small wooden chest placed beside the embalming table. Inside lies a carefully arranged set of tiny objects carved from stone, faience, gold, and glass. Some are shaped like animals, others like symbols, and a few resemble miniature pieces of jewelry. Each one has a specific purpose. Some mummies contain dozens of them tucked carefully between the layers of linen, almost like spiritual insurance policies. The first amulet the priest lifts from the chest is shaped like a small beetle. This is the scarab. The scarab beetle was deeply symbolic in Egyptian culture. Observing the way dung beetles rolled balls across the ground, Egyptians associated the insect with the sun, God rolling the sun across the sky each day. As a result, the scarab became a symbol of rebirth and regeneration. For mummies, a special version called the heart scarab was sometimes placed over the chest. This amulet was believed to help the deceased during the judgment ceremony when the heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. The heart scarab often carried an inscription begging the heart not to betray its owner during judgment. Essentially, it was a magical reminder telling the heart to behave itself, which is a surprisingly relatable concern, honestly. The priest places a scarab carefully on the mummy's chest before wrapping another layer of linen over it. Next comes an amulet shaped like an eye. You've already glimpsed this symbol earlier. Eye of Horus. The Eye of Horus represented healing, protection, and restoration. According to myth, the god Horus lost his eye in a battle with the god Seth. The eye was later magically restored, making it a symbol of recovery and wholeness. Placed within the mummy's wrappings, the Eye of Horus was believed to guard the body from harm and restore its strength in the afterlife. It's almost like installing a supernatural security camera inside the bandages. Another amulet appears next, this one shaped like a small pillar. This is the Djed symbol. The Djed pillar represented stability and endurance, was associated with the backbone of the god Osiris, the ruler of the afterlife. Osiris. By placing the Djed amulet along the spine of the mummy, embalmers hoped to strengthen the body and ensure it could stand upright again in the next world. Historians still debate whether Egyptians literally believed the body would physically reanimate in the afterlife, or if these symbols were meant more metaphorically. Either way, the symbolism is striking. Imagine carefully reinforcing someone's spine, just in case they need it thousands of years later. The embalmers continue adding amulets one by one. Some protect the throat, others guard the heart. Some are meant to strengthen the limbs or guide the soul through the underworld. The placement of these objects wasn't random. Priests followed traditional guidelines about where each amulet should go within the wrappings. Archaeologists have even discovered papyrus instructions describing the proper arrangement of amulets during mummification. It's almost like a very ancient assembly manual. Except instead of building furniture, you're preparing someone for eternity. You notice the apprentice bringing over another tray of small charms. Some are made from bright blue faience, a glazed ceramic material Egyptians loved for its vibrant color. Blue symbolized the Nile, the sky, and life itself. It's a reminder that even while dealing with death, Egyptian culture constantly focused on rebirth. One quirky detail historians sometimes mention is that a few mummies have been found with unusual personal items hidden within their wrappings, things like rings, jewelry, or small keepsakes. These may have been placed there by family members who wanted their loved one to carry familiar objects into the afterlife. Historians still argue whether these additions were part of official ritual practice or simply personal gestures made during the embalming process. Either way, it's strangely touching. Even in such a formal and carefully structured ritual, families still found ways to leave small reminders of love. Layer by layer, the linen wrappings continue to grow thicker as the amulets disappear beneath the cloth. By the time the embalmers finish, the mummy contains an entire hidden network of magical protection. Scarab over the heart, jed along the spine, eyes, knots, pillars, and symbols scattered throughout the body, each one guarding against some unseen danger in the afterlife. Finally, the last layers of linen are secured with resin, sealing the mummy's protective shell. The body now rests quietly on the table, wrapped from head to toe in pale cloth. It looks peaceful, almost serene, but the preparation still isn't quite complete. Because before the mummy can be placed inside its coffin and sent to the tomb, one final ritual must take place. A ceremony that restores the senses of the dead. A ritual meant to allow the mummy to breathe, speak, see, and hear again in the afterlife. And when you witness it, you might feel as though the ancient Egyptians were doing something remarkably close to waking the dead. The mummy now lies fully wrapped on the embalming table, its pale linen layers smooth and firm, the shape of the person still faintly visible beneath the careful work of the embalmers. Weeks of preparation have passed, washing, organ removal, drying in natron, oils, resins, amulets hidden deep within the bandages. By most practical standards, the job is finished. But in ancient Egypt, practical steps were only half the story, because before the mummy could be placed in its coffin and carried to the tomb, the priests needed to perform one final ritual, a ceremony meant to restore the senses of the dead. You follow the small procession leaving the workshop as twilight settles across the Nile Valley. The sky glows with deep orange and violet streaks while the air cools slightly after the long desert day. The mummy rests on a wooden bier, carried carefully by attendants. Priests walk ahead, holding incense burners, their robes swaying gently as fragrant smoke drifts into the evening air. The ceremony will take place near the tomb. This ritual is known as the opening of the mouth. Opening of the mouth. It was one of the most important funerary ceremonies in ancient Egyptian religion. Without it, the deceased might remain silent and powerless in the afterlife. The idea behind the ritual was simple but profound. It symbolically reactivated the senses of the dead person, sight, speech, hearing, breathing, all restored through sacred gestures and prayers. You arrive at the tomb entrance just as the last light of the sun dips behind the desert horizon. Torches flicker along the stone walls, casting long shadows across carved hieroglyphs that describe the deceased person's life. Nearby, family members gather quietly. Some wipe away tears, others watch solemnly, trusting the priests to perform the ceremony correctly, because if anything went wrong here, well, eternity was at stake. The chief priest approaches the mummy wearing a ceremonial mask representing the jackal-headed god who oversees burial rituals. Anubis. In the torchlight, the mask's dark face seems almost alive, its golden eyes reflecting the fire. He carries a small ritual tool shaped somewhat like a curved blade. This instrument is known as an adze, and it will be used to touch different parts of the mummy's face during the ceremony. Historians widely agree that the opening of the mouth ritual dates back thousands of years, possibly originating during Egypt's earliest dynastic periods. Versions of the ceremony appear not only in human burials, but even in the consecration of statues and temple idols. In other words, Egyptians used it whenever they wanted to symbolically activate something. Tonight, that activation is meant for the deceased. The priest raises the adze and gently touches the mummy's mouth area through the linen wrappings. He recites ancient words meant to restore the ability to speak. Then he touches the eyes, restoring sight. Next, the ears, restoring hearing. Finally, the nose, restoring breath. The chant echoes softly in the warm evening air as incense smoke curls toward the darkening sky. It's an eerie but strangely beautiful moment. To the ancient Egyptians watching, this ritual truly mattered. They believed the ceremony allowed the deceased person to eat, drink, speak, and interact with the world again once they entered the afterlife. Without it, the mummy might remain trapped in silence. Historians still debate how literally Egyptians believed these rituals worked. Some scholars think the ceremonies were symbolic acts reinforcing cultural beliefs about rebirth. Others argue that many Egyptians genuinely believed these actions restored real spiritual abilities. Either way, the ritual carried enormous emotional importance. Imagine saying goodbye to someone while believing this ceremony might give them their senses back in another world. It would feel incredibly meaningful. The priest now steps aside while attendants present offerings beside the mummy. Bread, beer, fruits, and cuts of meat are arranged on small tables. Food offerings were essential in Egyptian burials. The Ka spirit, the life force you learned about earlier, was believed to consume the spiritual essence of these foods. Think of it as ghost dining. Conveniently, the physical food could still be eaten by the living afterward. Ancient Egyptians were many things, but they were not wasteful. You glance toward the tomb entrance where workers prepare the coffin. The mummy will soon be placed inside a decorated sarcophagus carved with protective spells and images of gods. Royal mummies sometimes rested inside multiple coffins, nested together like elaborate wooden dolls. Ordinary people usually had simpler versions, though still decorated with care. One quirky detail historians have noticed is that coffin decorations often show the deceased person with large, stylized eyes painted on the surface. The idea was that the mummy could look out from the coffin and see the offerings placed nearby. It's a strangely comforting design. Imagine spending eternity with a nice window view. As the final prayers conclude, the priest lowers his hands and the gathered family members bow their heads. The opening of the mouth ritual is complete. Symbolically, the dead person can now see, speak, breathe, and hear again. Soon, the mummy will be sealed inside its coffin and carried into the tomb. And there, surrounded by objects meant to last forever, the body will begin its long rest beneath the desert sands. But not all tombs are the same. Some are modest chambers carved into rock. Others are vast monuments filled with treasure and elaborate decorations meant to impress even the gods. And the grandest of these tombs belong to Egypt's most powerful rulers, the pharaohs. Soon you'll step into those enormous burial places where mummification reached its most extravagant and mysterious form. Because when the king of Egypt prepared for eternity, nothing about the process was small. The torches flicker softly outside the tomb as the final echoes of the ritual fade into the desert night. The mummy rests quietly on its wooden bier, wrapped in pale linen, its hidden amulet sealed beneath layer after layer of cloth. Family members stand nearby in silence, watching as attendants prepare to carry the body into its final resting place. You follow them toward the tomb entrance, carved into the rocky hillside beyond the green edge of the Nile Valley. A cool breath of air drifts outward from the chamber, smelling faintly of dust, resin, and ancient stone. Inside, the walls are covered with colorful paintings, scenes of farming, boats sailing along the Nile, servants bringing food and drink, animals wandering through lush fields. These images aren't just decoration, they're instructions for eternity. Ancient Egyptians believed that whatever was painted inside the tomb could magically become real in the afterlife. If the wall shows bread, the deceased can eat bread. If it shows cattle, they will have cattle. Think of it as the ultimate illustrated grocery list for the next world. This idea becomes especially elaborate in the tombs of Egypt's rulers, the pharaohs. Pharaohs were not merely kings in the ordinary sense. Egyptians believed they were divine figures, living intermediaries between the gods and humanity. When a pharaoh died, their journey into the afterlife carried cosmic importance. Their successful rebirth ensured the stability of the universe itself. No pressure. You step deeper into the tomb chamber, where workers carefully place the mummy's coffin into a large stone sarcophagus. The lid is carved with the stylized face of the deceased, painted with calm eyes and a serene expression. For ordinary Egyptians, coffins were usually wooden and fairly simple. For pharaohs, however, things were on a completely different scale. Royal mummies were often placed inside several nested coffins, each more elaborate than the last. The outermost coffin could rest within a massive stone sarcophagus, sometimes weighing several tons, and that was just the beginning. The entire tomb might be filled with objects intended to serve the king in the afterlife. Furniture, weapons, jewelry, chariots, clothing, even full-sized boats. One of the most famous examples of this burial tradition was discovered in 1922, when archaeologists uncovered the nearly intact tomb of the young king, Tutankhamun. Inside his tomb were more than 5,000 objects, everything from golden statues to sandals and board games. His mummy itself was protected by 3 nested coffins, the innermost made of solid gold. Historians widely agree that Tutankhamun's tomb gives us one of the best glimpses into how royal burials worked, simply because so few other tombs survived intact. Most had been robbed long before modern archaeologists arrived. You walk through another chamber filled with storage jars, chests, and small statues arranged carefully along the walls. These little figures look like servants holding tools. They are called shabtis. Shabti. Remember those small figurines you saw earlier in simpler burials? In royal tombs, they appear in enormous numbers, sometimes hundreds of them. The idea was wonderfully convenient. In the afterlife, if the gods asked the deceased to perform labor, farming fields, digging canals, carrying water, these magical servant statues would answer the call instead. Imagine filing your taxes in the afterlife only to have a tiny statue raise its hand and say, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." Eternal life suddenly sounds much more manageable. Historians still argue whether Egyptians literally believed shabtis would animate and perform work, or whether they symbolized wealth and status. Either way, the symbolism is clear. The richer you were in life, the more help you expected in eternity. As you move through the tomb, your torchlight glides across walls painted with images of gods guiding the deceased through the afterlife. One of the most prominent figures appears again and again, Osiris. Osiris, the ruler of the underworld, was believed to judge and welcome the dead into eternal life. Many tomb scenes show the deceased standing before him, offering prayers and gifts. because every mummy, in a way, was meant to follow the same path Osiris once walked: death, preservation, and rebirth. You notice something else carved along the walls, long columns of hieroglyphic writing. These texts often include spells meant to guide the deceased safely through the dangers of the underworld. Some of these spells come from the funerary texts you heard about earlier. Book of the Dead. Despite the dramatic name, the Book of the Dead wasn't a single book, but rather a collection of spells and instructions copied onto papyrus scrolls and placed inside tombs. They served as a sort of supernatural travel guide. Need to pass a gate guarded by a snake demon? There's a spell for that. Need to transform into a bird to escape danger? There's a spell for that too. Historians still debate how many Egyptians could actually read these texts. Some scholars believe priests performed the spells aloud during ceremonies, while others argue that the written words themselves carried magical power, whether the deceased understood them or not. It's a fascinating blend of literacy and belief. Eventually, the workers finish arranging the tomb's contents. The sarcophagus lid is lowered into place with a deep, grinding sound of stone against stone. The mummy now rests in darkness, surrounded by treasures, protected by spells, prepared for eternity. Outside, the desert wind whispers across the cliffs, slowly covering the tomb entrance with drifting sand. For the pharaohs and the wealthy elite of Egypt, this was the grandest possible farewell. But not everyone in Egypt could afford such elaborate preparation. Most people lived simpler lives, and their mummification processes reflected that reality. Yet even ordinary Egyptians found ways to participate in this remarkable tradition of preserving the dead. And the next chapter of the story will take you into the surprisingly creative methods used by the middle class to secure their own place in eternity. The great royal tomb you just left behind slowly disappears beneath drifting desert sand. Its painted walls, golden treasures, and elaborate sarcophagus remain sealed in quiet darkness, waiting for eternity. But step back out into the wider world of ancient Egypt, and a simple truth becomes clear. Not everyone was a pharaoh. Most full royal-style mummification took 70 days, required skilled embalmers, expensive resins imported from distant lands, fine linen wrappings, carved coffins, protective amulets, and long rituals performed by priests. That kind of package would cost the ancient equivalent of a luxury vacation, except the vacation lasted forever and you never came back. So what did the average Egyptian do? They improvised. You wander now into a smaller embalming workshop, closer to a modest village along the Nile. The building is simpler than the grand facility used for nobles. The tools are fewer, the jars less ornate, and the linen stacks not nearly as impressive. Yet the purpose remains exactly the same: preserve the body so the soul can live again. Historians widely agree that embalmers offer different packages depending on what a family could afford. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus once described 3 levels of mummification services available in Egypt. Herodotus, think of it as the ancient equivalent of economy, business class, and first class, except instead of extra legroom, you get more organs removed. The most expensive method was the full royal-style treatment you've already witnessed: brain removal, organ preservation in canopic jars, natron drying, oils, resins, linen wrapping, amulets, and elaborate coffins. The middle-tier version was somewhat simpler. In this method, embalmers did not remove the brain through the nose. Instead, they injected oils or chemicals into the body through a small incision and allowed the internal organs to dissolve before draining the cavity later. Yes, it's not exactly the spa treatment version of embalming, but it worked surprisingly well. The body still dried and preserved enough for burial, and the process cost significantly less. Then there was the cheapest option. For families who could afford very little, embalmers might simply clean the body and place it in natron for drying before wrapping it in basic linen. No fancy resins, no organ jars, no magical amulets hidden in the wrappings. Just the essential goal: stop decay. Historians still argue whether these cheaper methods produced true mummies or merely dried corpses. Some preserved remarkably well, while others deteriorated more quickly over time. Either way, the intention remained the same. Even modest families wanted their loved ones prepared for the afterlife. You step outside the workshop and notice something else interesting happening near the riverbank. Several bodies lie buried directly in shallow desert sand. No embalmers, no linen wrappings, no jars, just simple graves beneath the hot Egyptian sun. Surprisingly, this might have been the earliest form of mummification. Long before professional embalmers existed, Egyptians noticed that bodies buried in dry desert sand naturally preserved themselves. The heat and dryness pulled moisture from the corpse, creating a natural mummy. Nature was doing the job for free. This discovery likely inspired the entire artificial mummification process that developed later. Ironically, when Egyptians began placing bodies inside coffins and tombs, the natural drying effect of the desert sand stopped working. That forced embalmers to invent chemical methods like natron to replicate the same preservation. In other words, human ingenuity stepped in when architecture got in the way. One quirky detail archaeologists sometimes find in simpler burials is the use of painted burial masks made from materials like plaster or cartonnage, a mixture of linen and glue shaped into hardened layers. These masks were meant to represent the face of the deceased. Even if the preservation process wasn't perfect, the mask ensured the spirit could still recognize its body. And recognition mattered enormously in Egyptian belief. Remember the Ka and Ba spirits? They needed to locate the body each night in order to reunite and restore life. Lose the body, lose the afterlife. No pressure there either. Historians still debate exactly how widespread mummification became among ordinary Egyptians. Some scholars believe the practice gradually expanded over centuries until even middle-class families could afford simplified versions. Others argue that full mummification remained relatively rare outside elite groups. But archaeological evidence does show something interesting. By the later periods of Egyptian history, even animals were sometimes mummified in huge numbers. Cats, dogs, ibises, crocodiles, and occasionally even bulls. Some were beloved pets buried alongside their owners. Others were offered as sacred gifts to the gods. The Egyptians truly took the idea of preservation very seriously. In fact, entire cemeteries filled with animal mummies have been discovered near temples. One famous site contains millions of mummified ibises stacked inside underground chambers. That's an impressive number of very patient birds. Soon, the quiet village workshop fades behind you as the Nile glimmers under a pale moon. Somewhere in the distance, frogs croak along the riverbank, and the warm desert air carries the faint smell of wet mud and reeds. Life in ancient Egypt continues just as it always has. Farmers waking before sunrise, fishermen pushing small boats into the current, craftsmen hammering bronze tools in dusty courtyards. Yet beneath the ground, all across this land, thousands upon thousands of carefully wrapped bodies lie waiting. Mummies. At first, the practice belonged mainly to kings and nobles, but over centuries, the idea spread through Egyptian society like a slow ripple across water. More people wanted it, more embalmers learned the craft. More tombs were carved into cliffs and desert hills. Mummification gradually became a cultural obsession, and not just for humans. You walk now along a path leading toward a massive temple complex where priests tend sacred animals. The courtyard is filled with stone statues and incense burners, sending curls of fragrant smoke into the night sky. Inside one of the temple chambers sits a line of small sarcophagi. Each one holds an animal mummy. The Egyptians believed many animals were sacred manifestations of specific gods. Because of that, preserving them after death became an act of devotion. One of the most famous sacred animals was the cat. Cats were associated with the goddess Bastet, a protective deity connected with home, fertility, and joy. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was considered a serious crime in ancient Egypt. Historians widely agree that large numbers of cats were mummified both as beloved pets and as offerings to Bastet's temples. Some cat mummies were carefully wrapped in intricate geometric patterns using colored linen strips. They look almost like tiny works of textile art. And the numbers are staggering. Archaeologists have uncovered burial sites containing hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions, of animal mummies. One enormous cat cemetery discovered near the ancient city of Bubastis held layers of feline remains stacked beneath the sand. Imagine that, a city-sized cat memorial. Even the internet might struggle to compete with that level of feline dedication, but cats were only the beginning. Sacred ibis birds were also mummified in vast quantities because they were associated with the god Thoth, the deity of wisdom and writing, sacred ibis. At some temple sites, priests bred ibis birds, specifically so they could be mummified and sold as religious offerings to pilgrims. Yes, you heard that correctly. Pilgrims could purchase a pre-mummified bird as a gift for the gods. Think of it. For Egyptians, mummification symbolized transformation and eternal continuity. And that belief grew even stronger during later periods of Egyptian history when foreign empires began to rule the land. First came the Persians, then the Greeks, finally the Romans. Each new power brought its own customs, languages, and ideas. Yet the tradition of mummification stubbornly survived. During the Greek-influenced period following the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great, something fascinating happened. Greek artistic styles began mixing with traditional Egyptian burial practices. Mummies from this era sometimes feature incredibly realistic painted portraits attached to the wrappings. These are known today as Fayum mummy portraits. Fayum mummy portraits. Instead of the stylized golden masks seen in earlier burials, these portraits show lifelike faces painted with delicate shading and expressive eyes. Some look so vivid that they seem almost modern. You could easily imagine passing one of these people on the street today, though hopefully without the linen wrappings. Historians widely regard these portraits as some of the most remarkable paintings to survive from the ancient world. They also reveal something touching. Even as cultures blended and empires changed, Egyptians and newcomers alike still believed deeply in preserving the body for the afterlife. But eventually a new religious tradition would arrive in Egypt, one that viewed the treatment of the dead very differently. And slowly, over generations, the age-old art of mummification would begin to fade away. Still, yet for an astonishingly long time, the ancient Egyptian practice of mummification continues. You stand now in Egypt during the later periods of its history, when Greek and Roman influences mingle with traditions thousands of years older. Markets bustle with traders speaking different languages, temples stand beside newly built Roman-style structures, and priests still whisper familiar prayers over the dead. Even under new rulers, the Egyptians keep doing what they have always done. They preserve their bodies, they wrap the dead in linen, they prepare for eternity. Historians widely agree that mummification remained common well into the Roman period of Egyptian history, long after Egypt was conquered and governed as a province of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire. But if you look closely, the tradition is slowly changing. Earlier mummies were wrapped in intricate geometric linen patterns with golden masks or painted faces. By the Roman period, the style becomes simpler in some cases, but in other ways, more personal. You enter a dim burial chamber where several mummies lie side by side. Each one has a strikingly lifelike painted portrait placed over the face. These are the remarkable works known today as Fayum mummy portraits. Unlike earlier stylized burial masks, these portraits show individuals with realistic features, curly hair, expressive eyes, jewelry, even subtle facial expressions. They were painted using techniques similar to Roman panel paintings, often with hot wax pigments that gave the surface a glowing texture. For a moment you feel an uncanny sensation. These people look almost alive. You could imagine them stepping out of the tomb and asking if you've seen their sandals. Historians still argue whether the people buried with these portraits were ethnically Egyptian, Greek settlers, or Roman citizens living in Egypt. The truth is probably a mix of all three. Egypt at this time had become a cultural crossroads, but while artistic styles changed, the underlying belief remained deeply Egyptian. The body must survive, the soul needs a home. Mummification still mattered. However, the world beyond Egypt was also changing, especially in terms of religion. Gradually, a new faith spread through the Roman Empire. Christian beliefs about death and the afterlife differed significantly from traditional Egyptian ideas. Instead of preserving the body through elaborate embalming, early Christians focused more on spiritual resurrection. The body itself did not need to remain perfectly intact. Faith, not preservation, became the path to eternal life. Over time, this new worldview began to influence Egyptian society. Christian communities in Egypt, known historically as the Copts, developed their own burial customs. Bodies were still treated respectfully, but the elaborate processes of organ removal, natron drying, and intricate wrappings slowly became less common. Historians widely believe that by the 4th century CE, traditional mummification had largely faded away. The workshops that once carefully dried bodies with natron closed their doors. The embalmers, who spent decades mastering the art of wrapping linen layers, gradually disappeared. A practice that had lasted more than 3,000 years quietly ended. That's a longer run than most civilizations managed to survive. But the story doesn't end there, because long after the last Egyptian mummy was wrapped, the world outside Egypt began to rediscover them. During the Middle Ages and early modern period, travelers and merchants exploring Egypt occasionally stumbled upon ancient tombs filled with preserved bodies. And what they did next? Well, it's a strange chapter of history. Some mummies were ground into powder and sold as medicine. Yes, really. A substance known as mumia was believed in medieval Europe to contain healing properties, simply because it came from preserved bodies coated in resin. People took it to treat headaches, wounds, and various illnesses. Historians still debate how widespread this practice actually was, but evidence suggests it occurred frequently enough to become a minor industry. Imagine explaining to an ancient Egyptian priest that his carefully prepared mummy would someday be used as headache medicine. He would probably be less than thrilled. Other mummies ended up in private collections and curiosity cabinets owned by wealthy Europeans fascinated by the mysteries of ancient Egypt. Some were even unwrapped publicly during Victorian-era gatherings, part academic study, part bizarre entertainment. It's one of those historical moments where curiosity got a little carried away. Fortunately, modern archaeology treats mummies with far greater respect and scientific care. Today, they are studied using advanced technologies that allow researchers to examine the bodies without damaging them. CT scanners, DNA analysis, chemical testing. All of these tools help scientists learn about ancient diseases, diets, medical knowledge, and daily life in Egypt thousands of years ago. So even though the tradition of mummification eventually faded, the mummies themselves continue to tell their stories. stories that survived thousands of years beneath desert sand, stories that you are still uncovering tonight. And in the final part of this journey, you'll see how these preserved bodies transformed our modern understanding of one of history's most fascinating civilizations. The desert night stretches quietly across the Nile Valley as centuries continue to slide past like slow-moving dunes. Tomb entrances vanish beneath sandstorms, temples crumble, entire cities disappear under drifting layers of dust and time. Yet beneath the surface, the mummies remain, wrapped in linen, protected by resin, waiting in silent darkness. For thousands of years, the ancient Egyptians believed they had prepared these bodies for eternity. In a way, they were right, just not in the way they expected, because eventually people from a completely different age would arrive, armed not with incense and natron, but with notebooks, shovels, and an almost unstoppable curiosity. You find yourself now standing in Egypt during the 19th century when explorers, scholars, and archaeologists from around the world began searching for the lost treasures of the ancient world. And when they started opening tombs, what they discovered astonished everyone. Mummies, thousands of them, perfectly preserved faces staring out from the distant past. One of the most famous discoveries happened in 1922 when archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered the nearly intact tomb of the young king, Tutankhamun. Hidden beneath the sands of the Valley of the Kings for more than 3,000 years, the tomb still contained its golden treasures, furniture, statues, chariots, and at its center, the carefully preserved mummy of the boy pharaoh himself. When Carter first peered inside the burial chamber by candlelight, he reportedly said he saw wonderful things, and it was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. Historians widely agree that the tomb of Tutankhamun offered an almost unmatched glimpse into the burial practices of ancient Egypt. Because so many other royal tombs had been robbed long before modern archaeologists arrived, this discovery felt like opening a perfectly sealed time capsule. Inside, researchers could finally study how ancient embalmers had prepared royal bodies, and what they learned was remarkable. Modern CT scans have shown that Tutankhamun's body still contained traces of resin, linen layers, and the careful techniques used by embalmers over 70 days of preparation. Even tiny amulets remained hidden inside the wrappings. These discoveries confirmed many of the details historians had long suspected about the mummification process. But mummies didn't just reveal burial customs, they revealed life. Today, scientists use advanced medical imaging to examine mummies without disturbing their wrappings. CT scanners allow researchers to look inside the bodies in incredible detail. They can see broken bones, dental problems, signs of arthritis, even traces of ancient diseases. Historians still argue whether some Egyptian rulers suffered from genetic disorders caused by royal family intermarriage, and modern mummy studies continue to explore those questions. In a strange way, these preserved bodies have become some of the most informative historical documents we possess. Because unlike written records, which can exaggerate or lie, the human body quietly tells the truth. What people ate, how old they lived to be, what illnesses they suffered, even how physically demanding their daily lives were. Mummies have also helped scientists study ancient epidemics. Evidence of diseases such as tuberculosis and malaria has been detected in preserved tissues from Egyptian remains. These discoveries give researchers a deeper understanding of how illnesses spread through ancient populations, all from bodies that were never meant to be studied thousands of years later. The embalmers preparing these mummies believed they were protecting the soul for the afterlife. Instead, they preserved an entire civilization's medical history. It's a rather unexpected side effect, of course. Modern archaeologists now treat these remains with far greater care and respect than earlier explorers sometimes did. Museums carefully preserve mummies in climate-controlled environments. Researchers use non-invasive scanning technology whenever possible, ensuring that the bodies remain intact. In many ways, the ancient Egyptians would probably approve. After all, the entire purpose of mummification was preservation, and these mummies are still being preserved, still being studied, still being remembered. You imagine the embalmers who once worked beside the Nile, carefully washing bodies with palm wine, packing natron around limbs, wrapping linen strips for hours beneath the desert sun. They believed they were preparing their people for eternal life in the afterworld. Yet in another sense, they achieved something just as extraordinary. They preserved the past itself. Now the desert wind moves softly across the sand, whispering over buried tombs and silent monuments. And the long journey you began tonight, the strange, careful process of turning the dead into mummies, finally begins to fade into stillness. The embalming workshops grow quiet. The priests extinguish their incense burners. The linen wrappings rest undisturbed beneath stone lids. You step back from the ancient world slowly, letting the images soften. The golden mask glimmering in torchlight. The gentle chanting of priests. The scent of myrrh and cedar oils drifting through the warm night air. These people lived thousands of years ago, yet through their careful rituals, their beliefs still echo faintly today. And now, as the Nile flows endlessly beneath the stars, you let the story drift away like sand carried on the evening wind. Your breathing slows. The desert night grows calm and wide. Nothing urgent remains here, only the quiet patience of history resting beneath the earth. So, allow your thoughts to settle. Let the ancient tombs close once more. And somewhere beneath the endless dunes of Egypt, the mummies continue their silent watch, wrapped in linen, waiting peacefully beneath the desert sky.